conversation with your elected representatives, because I don't think anybody can do it unless you have thousands of dollars to fork out, or unless you're a member of a secret society, or unless you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. You don't have access to your quote-unquote elected representatives, and therefore they do not represent you. Who do they represent? They represent the rich. They represent the luxocrats. So when you talk about the Democrats and the Republicans, they're really both the same thing. They're really rich, white luxocrats. We don't need them. They're not helping us. They're not in it for us. They're in it for themselves. And they're in it for themselves at the expense of everyone else. So, understanding that, okay, the Republicans are truly evil, so they're not going to help us, and the Democrats are truly ignorant, so they're not going to help us, who's going to do it? And you got some people on one side going, well, how about the libertarians? And I can sympathize with them because, I've got a little bit of a libertarian bent myself, but you got the same problem there, really, which is the libertarians don't operate from depth knowledge and depth understanding. Just like the Democrats and Republicans, their ideology comes first, and then from their ideology, they try to project their ideology into any given problem and say that our ideology is the solution for the problem. Ideology is never the solution for a problem. Only science, truth, and science facts and the actual, real, factual information empowers us to solve problems. So then on the other side, you got the people who want to join the socialists or the Greens, right? The far left. And that's the same thing, right? The Greens are really great, and I could really sympathize with all the different political parties out there. In some senses, I could sympathize with the Greens the most, and yet it's the same thing. Am I going to convince them to suddenly wake up and change from being ideology-based to being truth-based? No. And I can tell you because I've tried. You can't talk to these people. What you have to do then is you have to realize that there isn't an organization out there, a political party as such, that actually represents us, that actually represents the truth, that actually represents sanity instead of ideology. So, let's start one. And I'm working on doing that, and I think that National Initiative for Democracy, which is an organization I've actually very recently become involved in, is probably the best bet, the best hope that we have for starting something. So let's talk about National Initiative for Democracy. Maybe some people might actually recognize that, and they might even more remember Mike Gravel, who ran for president as a Democrat this last election cycle. His idea is this: what if we had the ability for we the people to write our own laws? Just like Congress, just like the Senate, what if there was a third branch of legislative government, we the people, and we wrote our own laws? My point to Mike Gravel is, not only do we need to do that because of assorted problems of the political parties, but we need to do that because there is no other solution. Only we, the people, are ever going to climb out of this box together. You're never going to get the Greens or the Libertarians or the Socialists or the Republicans or the Democrats, because when you get right down to it and you pull back the veil, there's some batch of rich guys that are still running that. It's still run by some bunch of people who have a vested interest in the status quo and in keeping things to some extent the same way that they are, to benefit only the upper crust and not the rest of the people. Our civilization has become a pyramid scheme. You got people at the top and all the rest of us at the bottom. That's not democracy. So in order to achieve real democracy, what we really need to do is we need to, A, become informed, because there is no such thing as democracy in ignorance. You can't have an ignorant opinion and basically have an opinion which somebody else told you to have, and have that be real democracy. Because all that really is the top telling the bottom what to think. Right? That's not democracy. That's essentially a very subtle form of manipulation and control and domination. So that's not democracy. So the only way for us to achieve real democracy is to kind of rise up together and start really looking for and seizing the facts and looking for the real information that does exist out there in our textbooks, in our colleges, in our libraries, on the internet. The solutions are out there. National Initiative for Democracy is this thing that I actually learned about when I was attempting to work with Dennis Kucinich back 2 election cycles ago. And I was on his site, and I worked really, really hard for 6 months to get a lot of information on his site, and you know what they did to me? They just deleted it all. Why? Because at the end of the game, Dennis Kucinich is a Democrat, and he's been infiltrated by Democrats, and they don't want the truth. They don't want the solution. So he's shooting himself in the foot, basically, bang, shooting himself in the foot by trying to be a Democrat and trying to have the Democrats run his campaign. Because what happens is I went and I provided the solutions to the problems and put them on his site, but at the very end of the game, I'm saying, well, you know, John Kerry's ideas, this is what's wrong with them. And they delete that because what's going on is they've already decided, even inside of the Dennis Kucinich campaign, secretly, that they're just going to shuffle all the Dennis Kucinich stuff away. It's all kind of a scam. What happens is Dennis Kucinich ends up being used by the Democratic Party to suck people back to the party who would not otherwise come to the Democratic Party. And then they are shuffled from there to go ahead and say, oh, well, Dennis Kucinich didn't make it, so we'll just go ahead and put up with John Kerry. Well, what happened? John Kerry lost the election, and I knew he was going to lose the election because he was a crummy candidate. He wasn't a very good speaker, he wasn't a very good thinker, he didn't have any real-life solutions. And if you actually bothered to read his platform, which very few people did, he sounded like George Bush the clone. He sounded exactly like George Bush. He wanted, world domination, he wanted to have, how many people would have voted for John Kerry if they actually bothered to read that one of John Kerry's brilliant ideas is he wanted to have mandatory 2 years of armed forces service, not just for men, but for women also, immediately upon exiting high school. So, in our country, if we had actually elected John Kerry president, and he'd gotten what he wanted, right, not only would we have been at war in Iraq, we would have been mandatory. Everybody who graduates from high school has to spend 2 years in the armed forces. That's not a real option to George Bush's fascism. It's the same thing. So I knew Kerry was going to lose, and I knew why. And I said why on Dennis Kucinich's site, and it all got deleted. Why? Because Dennis Kucinich's site is infiltrated by status quo Democrats. The same thing happened in that election with the general. What was his name? Wesley Clark. And, basically he was infiltrated in different ways. And the same thing also happened to, Howard Dean. He was infiltrated from the inside.